Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to your conference, and I'm really sorry I can't be here in person. My name is Clive Bates. I used to be the Director of Action on Smoking and Health, the largest anti-smoking organisation in the United Kingdom. I've since been a civil servant, and now I run my own consulting business. I have no conflicts of interest to declare with respect to tobacco companies, nicotine companies, or pharmaceutical companies. My primary interest is in public health and the way that tobacco harm reduction could reduce the burden of death and disease associated with smoking, one of the biggest public health problems we have today. My presentation today will have 5 main themes. Firstly, an overview of the concept of tobacco harm reduction. Secondly, a look into how risky vaping is compared to smoking. Thirdly, the concerns that people raise about gateway effects. Fourthly, where policy making can actually make things worse. And then finally, fifthly, what would sensible regulation actually look like? So my first theme for the day is the concept of tobacco harm reduction itself. The idea was first articulated properly in the 1970s, and it's based on this idea that people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. And what this means is that the nicotine itself is a relatively benign drug, but it's the reason why people smoke. It doesn't really do very much harm. What people get sick from is inhaling the toxic products of combustion of setting fire to tobacco leaf and the soot and the tar and the toxic gases that they take into the lungs. That's what's doing all the damage. So where that leads us is the idea if people can take nicotine without the combustion of tobacco, without setting fire to tobacco leaves, then potentially they could avoid most of the harm that they would incur, most of the cancer, heart disease, and respiratory illnesses that come from smoking. And there are now a wide range of products capable of doing it. So we have e-cigarettes, which use nicotine-bearing liquid, which is then heated and inhaled. We have heated tobacco products, in which the tobacco is heated but not burnt. We have smokeless tobacco products, which have been around for many years, but there's lots of new products coming out onto the market. And then we also have novel nicotine products, which are just ways of taking nicotine without setting fire to tobacco. These are all part of the product suite of tobacco harm reduction. And the challenge for regulators is to bring them in and encourage people to switch from the most dangerous to the least dangerous. So let's move on to my second theme for the day. How risky is e-cigarette use or vaping compared to smoking? Now, everyone will say we don't have enough long-term data to know. And of course, it's true. We can't go 50 years into the future and find out what happened. But that's true of any new product. It doesn't mean we know nothing. In fact, we know a great deal about the risks of vaping. And the reason is that we can measure the toxicity of the emissions, and we can measure the exposure of toxins in people's bodies. We can find out how much are they exposed compared to smoking. And what we find is that for the key hazardous agents that do most of the harm associated with smoking, either those things are not present at detectable levels, or they are present at much, much lower levels, 1 to 3 orders of magnitude lower. So on the basis of that, organisations like the Royal College of Physicians, for example, in London, have concluded that vaping or e-cigarette use is likely to be no more than 5% of the risk of smoking and likely to be substantially lower than that. So we're talking about at least a 95% reduction in risk. And those kind of findings are now sort of accepted, that the level of risk will be very much lower. Not everyone's prepared to put a fixed number on it, but very much lower risk than smoking. And that's where the public health opportunity comes from. Let's now turn to my third theme for today, which is the concerns that people have about gateway effects. And this is the idea that even if vaping is much less harmful, the danger is it will create a new pathway for people to take up smoking, and the total harm to the population will be more as a result. So let's just say this clearly. There is no evidence from anywhere in the world that this is actually happening. It is not a thing. It's a theoretical idea. What there is a lot of confusion about it because the same things that incline people to smoke, to do with their parental background, their schooling, the situation they're in, may also incline them to vape. So what you see is these two things often occur together, but it isn't one causing the other. And we can all take some comfort from the overall data. So in countries like the United States, the rate of smoking has declined amongst adults, has declined very rapidly during the time when vaping has risen. The same is also true for the rate of smoking among adolescents. It's also fallen dramatically during the time that vaping has risen in the population as a whole. So if there was a gateway effect, you would expect to see more smoking and not much less. And so I think we can be reassured really that there isn't very much to this concern, but it is a source of active debate amongst academics. So let me now move on to my fourth theme for the day, which is the danger of bad policy making. So can regulators or policymakers make things worse and actually cause more damage to health than there would otherwise be? The answer, I'm afraid, is yes, they can. They can make things worse, they can cause harm, they can cause more disease and death. And the reason is set out very clearly in this statement from the Royal College of Physicians, that if they make the products less attractive, less accessible, more expensive, less able to simulate the pharmacological effects of cigarettes, if they just make the products more boring, less appealing to smokers, then people won't switch. And the danger is, instead of switching, they will carry on smoking. And what you get is policies that you think are, being tough on vaping, end up effectively protecting the cigarette trade and perpetuating smoking. And that's how regulators can make things worse. And finally, let's turn to my fifth theme for the day, which is what would good regulation actually look like? But I'm just going to go through 5 ideas very quickly. Firstly, use differential rates of taxation. Create a fiscal incentive for people to switch from smoking to vaping by having a higher tax on smoking and a lower tax or no tax, ideally, on vaping. Secondly, if there are concerns about risks, electrical risks, chemical risks, mechanical or thermal risks, then devise some standards. Say, these products can only be put on the market if they achieve these standards. And there's good sets of standards now being developed in Europe, for example, which everybody's going to be free to copy. Third area is to be truthful about risk and to communicate the risk of these things clearly to smokers. And in fact, in Britain now, we've had the government advertising e-cigarettes on television to encourage smokers to switch, endorsing the idea that it's a sensible pathway for them to take. So if people don't know that they're likely to be at least 95% less risky than smoking, why should they bother? Why should they try? So we have to be candid and truthful about the risks. Fourthly, the policy about vaping in public places. The question is not, is it right or wrong to have vaping in a certain place? The question is, who should decide? And in my view, the right person to decide is the owner or manager of the property, not the government, unless and until the government has a rationale, a good reason to override the preferences of the property owner or manager. So if a bar wants to have a vaping room or a vaping night, or a hotel wants to allow vaping in its bar but not in its restaurant and not in its bedrooms, if a centre for senior citizens wants to allow a vaping area to encourage its residents to switch to smoking, then why shouldn't it? The government needs a reason to override that, and at the moment there's no sign of any reason why they should override the preferences of owners and managers of properties. And then fifthly, have some age-related controls. Nobody wants to see kids vaping or smoking, so make sure the products are only sold to 18-year-olds. Make sure that the marketing of these products is not targeted at children. There's no billboards outside schools or on children's TV hour or whatever. Create some reassurance that this is a product designed for adults. And I think if you can do those 5 things, then mostly people will start to see the benefits. They'll worry less about any of the risks and concerns they have, and will start to see the big public health gains that you get from, from having this kind of regime. So that's a rapid overview of how I see the issues, how we see the issues in Britain. May I wish you all the best for a successful conference and interesting discussions today. Thank you very much for your attention.